The night I found out my husband was leaving the United States forever, I was standing barefoot in our kitchen at 11:42 at night, staring at the glow of his iPad like it was a heart monitor flatlining in front of me. The subject line read, International Wire Confirmation. Nearly $1 million had been transferred to a bank in Vancouver, Canada. The amount was listed in numbers and spelled out in words, as if to make sure there was no misunderstanding. I read it twice, then a third time. My pulse didn't spike. It slowed. The same clinical calm settled over me that I relied on when a trauma patient rolled through the emergency room doors and everyone else started to panic. Behind me, I heard Brandon's footsteps on the hardwood floor. "I was going to tell you," he said. Not sounding sorry, not sounding nervous, just prepared. I turned to look at him, still holding the iPad in my hands. "You're moving money out of the country?" I asked. He didn't deny it. "I'm relocating," he said. 2 weeks. Vancouver. It's permanent. Permanent. He said it the way someone says they're switching gyms. Casual. Decided. "And the money?" I asked. He shrugged slightly. "It's for the transition. I've already filed for divorce. The house is listed. You'll get a fair settlement." A fair settlement. Like I was a vendor being paid off. "And who's in Vancouver?" I asked, even though I already knew. He didn't hesitate. "Samantha, my name. Just younger, 29. Product manager at his tech company. The woman he had apparently been planning a new life with while I was pulling 12-hour shifts at the hospital and coming home too tired to question why he needed a new password on everything. He believed he had planned the perfect escape. What he didn't realize was that the largest account he had touched was still in both our names. Earlier that evening, before the email lit up the kitchen, I had come home from the trauma floor exhausted and smelling faintly of antiseptic. I had spent the day stabilizing a car accident victim whose blood pressure refused to cooperate. I knew how to recognize when something inside a body was failing. I just hadn't applied that skill to my marriage. For months, there had been small irregularities. Late-night calls he took in the garage. Business expansion trips that lasted an extra day. A sudden interest in international tax law podcasts. He said it was the tech industry shifting globally. I told myself he was ambitious. I told myself stress changed people. When I saw the wire transfer notification, the dishwasher was humming softly behind me, and the overhead kitchen light cast a pale circle on the counter. The domestic normalcy of it felt almost insulting. I scrolled further into the email. The funds had originated from our joint brokerage account, the one we opened 8 years ago when Brandon insisted it was smarter for tax efficiency to consolidate investments under both names. I remembered signing the paperwork at the dining room table while he explained things in fast. Confident language about capital gains and long-term strategy. I had trusted him. Now I scanned the transaction details with a different lens. The transfer was large, but it wasn't spontaneous. There were references to prior liquidations, partial stock sales over the last few weeks. This had been staged, planned. I set the iPad down carefully. "When were you going to tell me?" I asked. "Soon," he said. I didn't want drama. Drama. As if quietly draining nearly $1 million and filing for divorce without telling your wife was the responsible alternative. "You already filed?" I asked. "Yes. It's straightforward. We don't have kids. It'll be clean." Clean. I felt something shift inside me then. Not heartbreak. Not even rage. A recalibration. "You said the house is listed," I said. "It goes live tomorrow." I've talked to a realtor. Of course he had. He stood there like a man who had rehearsed this conversation in the mirror. He spoke in bullet points. Logistics. Deadlines. Settlement estimates. "You'll be fine," he added. "You have your job." I thought about the nights I came home too tired to check our account balances because I believed partnership meant division of labor. I thought about the trust I placed in his confidence with numbers. "Is everything moved?" I asked quietly. "Almost," he said. "Just waiting on the international clearance." Almost. He walked upstairs a few minutes later, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the hum of the dishwasher and the faint citrus scent of the cleaner I'd used that morning. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I didn't call my sister or collapse on the floor. I picked up my phone instead. I logged into the brokerage account myself. It took me a minute to find the right portal. Brandon usually handled the logins, but my name was on the account. My social security number. My access credentials. When the dashboard loaded, I stared at the total balance. The transfer showed as pending international review, not completed. I clicked into the account details. Primary owner, Brandon Hayes. Co-owner, Samantha Hayes. Both names, still there. I scrolled further down to the authorization settings. Large-scale liquidation required dual verification. I wasn't an observer. I was a legal co-owner. I leaned back in the kitchen chair and let that reality settle in. Upstairs, I heard the soft thud of a suitcase being set on the bed. He believed he was 2 weeks away from disappearing. I glanced at the transaction status again. Pending? I whispered the word out loud, tasting it like a diagnosis. Then I opened a new browser tab and searched for a family law attorney in Charlotte specializing in high-asset divorce and financial disputes. By sunrise, I had an appointment scheduled. Brandon went to bed thinking he had already left me behind. He had no idea the only thing standing between him and Vancouver was a signature he had underestimated. I barely slept that night. But exhaustion has never been my weakness. By 6 a.m, I was already in my car outside the hospital parking garage, engine idling, staring at the steering wheel. The sky over Charlotte was still gray-blue, the kind of early light that makes everything look unfinished. My phone buzzed with a calendar reminder for my consultation at 9:15. I had scheduled it before Brandon's suitcase was even fully packed. Inside the hospital, the rhythm of my shift grounded me. Vitals, charting, medication checks, controlled decisions. I moved through the trauma floor like I always did, steady, precise, focused. No one looking at me would have guessed that my husband had filed for divorce and planned to relocate to Canada with another woman named Samantha. Around 10:30. During my break, I stepped into an empty stairwell and dialed the attorney's office to confirm the appointment. Yes, Ms. Hayes, the receptionist said. We have you down for a high-asset marital dispute consultation. High asset. The phrase sounded foreign attached to my life. I had always thought of us as comfortable. Not wealthy, responsible, not complicated. At 9:15 sharp, I was seated across from a woman named Laura Mitchell in a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown. She was in her early 40s, sharp-eyed, composed, the kind of person who read contracts the way I read lab results. Tell me everything, she said. I did. I told her about the nearly $1 million wire transfer. About Vancouver. About the e-filed divorce petition Brandon hadn't even mentioned until after I confronted him. About the house listing that was apparently going live without my consent. I slid my phone across the table and showed her the transaction status. Pending international clearance. Is the brokerage account joint? She asked. Yes. She nodded slowly. That's important. She asked about prior financial patterns. Had there been unusual withdrawals? Stock liquidations? Changes in beneficiaries? I remembered the small irregularities I had dismissed. The partial stock sales over the last month. The subtle way he had asked for my electronic signature for tax adjustments without explaining the details. I signed a few digital forms. I admitted, I didn't read them carefully. Laura didn't judge me. She just typed notes. We can petition for an emergency temporary restraining order, she said. If there's evidence of asset dissipation before divorce, the court can freeze joint accounts immediately. The words hit me with a strange mixture of relief and disbelief. You mean he can't just move everything and leave? I asked. Not if we act quickly. Quickly. I thought about Brandon upstairs the night before, calmly zipping his suitcase. About how confident he had sounded when he said, "It'll be clean." "It won't be clean," Laura said quietly, as if reading my thoughts. Not anymore. By 11 that morning, She had drafted the motion. By 2 in the afternoon. It was filed in Mecklenburg County Family Court. She attached screenshots of the pending transfer, documentation of the joint account ownership, and a statement outlining potential fraudulent conveyance of marital assets. While she handled the legal filings, I logged into the brokerage account again from my phone. The status still read pending. I clicked into transaction history more carefully this time. Over the last 6 weeks, Brandon had liquidated specific stock positions, high-growth tech shares that had vested through his company compensation package. He had converted them to cash in staggered increments. This wasn't impulsive. This was strategy. I scrolled further and felt my stomach tighten. 2 years earlier, I had received a significant workers' compensation settlement after a patient assaulted me during a night shift. The money had been deposited into that same joint brokerage account at Brandon's suggestion. "Let it grow," he had said. "It'll be smarter long-term." Now I realized that part of the nearly $1 million he tried to wire included my settlement funds, my injury, my pain, my recovery. I stepped into an empty exam room and locked the door for a moment. He hadn't just planned to leave. He had planned to take what I earned through blood and fear and therapy appointments and sleepless nights. I called Laura back immediately. "He transferred funds that include my personal injury settlement," I said. "Does that change anything?" "It strengthens our argument," she replied. "Especially if he didn't disclose the origin of those funds in the divorce filing." Disclosure. Transparency. Words Brandon had apparently redefined for himself. By late afternoon, the court granted a temporary financial restraining order pending a hearing. It required immediate notification to the brokerage firm and flagged the international wire for review. I received confirmation from the brokerage compliance department at 4:52 in the afternoon. Due to joint ownership and pending court review, the transaction has been temporarily suspended. Suspended. I exhaled slowly. Brandon texted me at 5:15. "Why is the account frozen?" There it was. The first crack in his perfect plan. I didn't respond immediately. I finished my shift. I changed out of my scrubs. I washed my hands carefully at the hospital sink, watching the soap swirl down the drain. When I finally replied, I kept it simple. "Talk to your attorney." 3 dots appeared almost instantly. "What did you do?" he asked. I stared at the message, remembering his tone the night before. Calm, assured, certain I would accept a fair settlement. I protected my half. I typed. A minute later, another text came through. My passport appointment was tomorrow. I set my phone face down on the counter and picked up my car keys. For the first time since I read that wire confirmation email, I felt something close to steadiness. He wasn't grounded by love. He wasn't grounded by regret. He was grounded by paperwork. And I had finally learned how to read it. Brandon didn't come home that night. Instead, he texted me from a hotel 20 minutes away. "This is unnecessary," he wrote. "You're overreacting." I sat at the kitchen island with my laptop open, the temporary restraining order document displayed on the screen, and read his message twice before responding. "You filed for divorce without telling me," I typed. "You tried to move nearly $1 million overseas. That's not an overreaction." That's a response. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "You're making this ugly." He finally sent ugly, as if I had started something. The next morning, I received a formal notification from his attorney requesting an expedited hearing to challenge the asset freeze. Brandon was arguing that the transfer was a standard relocation of personal earnings and that I was interfering with his professional transition. Personal earnings. I forwarded the email to Laura and then drove to the hospital for another 12-hour shift. All day, while I monitored heart rates and adjusted medication drips, I kept replaying his phrasing in my head. Personal earnings. As if our joint brokerage account had somehow transformed into his private wallet overnight. During my lunch break, I logged into the account again. The international wire still showed suspended pending compliance review. But something else caught my attention. Under recent activity, There was a note referencing an internal audit flag. The brokerage firm had marked the transaction for enhanced due diligence due to large cross-border transfer from joint ownership account during pending marital dissolution. Marital dissolution. The system had named what he tried to minimize. I clicked deeper into the transaction history and noticed another detail I had overlooked before. The receiving account in Vancouver wasn't solely in Brandon's name. It was listed as a joint account. Brandon Hayes and Samantha Lee. My chest tightened, not with heartbreak, but with clarity. He hadn't just planned to relocate. He had already merged finances with her. That afternoon, Laura called me. "We've received their motion," she said. "He's claiming the majority of the funds originated from his employment compensation and therefore constitute separate property. Does that hold up?" I asked. "Not automatically. Especially not in a commingled account used for joint investments and shared expenses." Commingled. Another word I had once ignored. He also failed to disclose the pending wire in his initial divorce filing. She continued. "That's problematic for him." Problematic. I leaned back in the break room chair, staring at the vending machine across from me. "He opened a joint account in Canada with her," I said quietly. Laura paused. "That complicates things for him further," she said. "It suggests intent to transfer marital assets into a new shared financial structure before equitable distribution." Equitable distribution. The law had language for everything. That evening, Brandon showed up at the house without warning. He let himself in with his key, as if nothing had shifted. We stood in the living room, the realtor's staging furniture arranged neatly around us. The for sale sign was already visible through the front window. "You froze the account," he said. "Not asking. I exercised my legal rights," I replied. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration visible for the first time. "You didn't have to involve the court. You involved the court when you filed for divorce without telling me." "That was procedural. So is this." He stared at me for a long moment. "You're going to cost both of us a lot of money with this fight." I thought about the workers' compensation settlement he had quietly folded into his escape fund. "You already tried to cost me everything," I said. His jaw tightened. "You wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't said anything," he muttered. That sentence landed harder than anything else. Not because it was cruel, because it was true. He had believed I wouldn't check. He had believed I didn't understand enough to intervene. "You underestimated me," I said calmly. "I trusted you to handle the finances." He shot back. "And I trusted you not to steal them." Silence filled the room. Outside, I could see neighbors slowing down as they drove past the sign in our yard. "I'm not stealing," he said finally. "I built most of that portfolio." "You built it while married," I replied, "with shared tax benefits, shared risk, shared capital." His phone buzzed in his hand. He glanced at it, then looked back at me. "It's compliance," he said. Irritation flaring. "They're asking for documentation." Of course they were. Large international transfers during a pending divorce were not subtle. "Maybe you should answer them," I said. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You think this is revenge?" I considered the question. "No," I said. "This is accountability." He laughed once, bitterly. "You're going to drag this out. I'm going to make sure what's mine stays mine." For the first time, I saw something different in his expression. Not anger, not arrogance. Concern. The hearing was scheduled for the following Tuesday. By then, the brokerage firm had formally notified both of us that the transfer would remain suspended until the court determined the proper allocation of marital assets. His flight to Vancouver had been booked for the end of the week. Non-refundable. That night, after he left again, I sat at the dining table with a printed copy of our original brokerage agreement. I read every line. Joint tenants with rights of survivorship. Equal authority. Equal ownership. Equal responsibility. I ran my finger over my own signature from 8 years ago. I had signed it without understanding its power. Now it was the very thing holding him in place. He thought he was 2 steps away from starting over. He hadn't realized the law moved slower, but it held tighter. And for the first time in our marriage, he wasn't controlling the timeline. The first court hearing lasted less than 40 minutes, but it changed everything. I sat at the petitioner's table beside Laura, hands folded in my lap, listening to Brandon's attorney argue that the frozen brokerage account was composed primarily of his earned stock compensation and that my emergency motion was excessive. Mrs. Hayes is attempting to interfere with my client's professional relocation, his attorney said smoothly. The funds in question represent years of performance-based equity. Performance-based equity, as if marriage had been a spectator sport. Laura stood when it was our turn. Your Honor, she began. This is not about relocation. It is about asset dissipation. My client discovered a pending international wire transfer of nearly $1 million from a joint investment account days after her husband filed for divorce without disclosure. The receiving account is jointly titled to Mr. Hayes and a third party. There it was. A third party. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked directly at Brandon. Mr. Hayes, did you disclose the pending transfer in your initial filing? Brandon hesitated for half a second too long. No. Your Honor, it had not finalized. The judge's expression didn't change. Disclosure is not contingent upon finalization. Laura handed over documentation showing the liquidation of specific stock holdings over the previous 6 weeks, the transfer request, and the original deposit record of my workers' compensation settlement. The transferred funds include proceeds from a personal injury settlement awarded to Mrs. Hayes 2 years ago, Laura added. I watched Brandon's jaw tighten. The judge reviewed the papers quietly. Given the circumstances, she said finally, the temporary restraining order will remain in effect pending full financial discovery. All joint accounts are to remain frozen except for reasonable living expenses. Mr. Hayes, you are prohibited from transferring or encumbering marital assets without written consent or further court approval. Reasonable living expenses. Prohibited. Written consent. Each word felt like a brace locking into place. Outside the courthouse, Brandon caught up to me before I reached my car. This is insane, he said under his breath. You've turned a straightforward divorce into a federal case. You turned a marriage into a liquidation plan, I replied. You're embarrassing me. I almost laughed. You filed for divorce without telling me and opened a joint account in another country with your girlfriend, I said. Embarrassment isn't my responsibility. He looked over his shoulder toward his attorney, who was speaking on the phone a few feet away. You think this ends well for you? He asked. I think it ends fairly. That afternoon, the brokerage firm sent a formal compliance notice requesting additional documentation regarding the source of funds and the purpose of the international transfer. Because of the court order, they were now required to report the transaction under enhanced scrutiny guidelines. Brandon texted me an hour later. They're asking about tax reporting implications. Did you tell them something? I told my lawyer, I responded. The court told them the rest. He didn't reply. The following week, I began the process of financial discovery. Bank statements, credit card records, retirement accounts. It felt invasive, but necessary. As I combed through our joint financial history with Laura's team, patterns emerged. Brandon had not only liquidated vested stock, he had also shifted smaller sums from our checking account into the brokerage in increments that barely registered individually. It was subtle, strategic. He had been building his exit for months. One evening, while reviewing transaction spreadsheets, I noticed something that made my stomach turn. 6 weeks before the wire request, Brandon had changed the beneficiary designation on a small life insurance policy tied to his employer. The new beneficiary was Samantha Lee. I stared at the line item, my name replaced quietly in a digital form submission. It wasn't just about money. It was about erasure. I forwarded the document to Laura. That's not illegal, she said carefully when she called me back. But it's relevant to intent. Intent. Another word that suddenly carried weight. Meanwhile, Brandon's planned departure date came and went. The non-refundable flight to Vancouver expired unused. He was still in Charlotte. Still technically employed. Though I heard through mutual acquaintances that his company had initiated an internal review due to legal complications involving cross-border transfers. Legal complications. The phrase felt almost clinical. A week later, I received a letter from the brokerage's compliance department requesting clarification on the origin of the workers' compensation funds deposited 2 years earlier, because those funds were part of the attempted transfer. They required confirmation that the proceeds were not being misrepresented. Misrepresented. I called Laura immediately. "This strengthens our position," she said. "If he attempted to characterize those funds as solely his earned income, that's problematic." Problematic was becoming my favorite understatement. That evening, Brandon showed up again, this time looking less polished. "They're asking for documentation about your settlement," he said. "Can you just confirm it was deposited jointly?" "It was deposited jointly," I said. "On your advice." He exhaled sharply. "If this gets flagged further, it could trigger a deeper review. Tax, employment disclosures. Then you should have thought about that before wiring it overseas." I interrupted. He ran his hands through his hair. "You're going to ruin my career. I'm protecting my assets. They're the same thing," he snapped. For him, maybe they were. For me, they were not. "I didn't file for divorce," I said quietly. "You did?" He stared at me, and for the first time since this began, I saw something close to uncertainty in his eyes. Not because I was emotional, because I was informed the house sale was officially paused pending equitable distribution. The realtor removed the online listing. Neighbors began asking subtle questions. I kept going to work, kept reviewing documents, kept reading every line before signing anything. The more I learned, the clearer it became. He hadn't expected resistance. He had expected compliance. Instead, he got scrutiny, and scrutiny was far more dangerous to his plan than anger ever could be. The first real crack in Brandon's confidence showed up in the form of a certified letter. It arrived on a Wednesday afternoon. Thick white envelope stamped with the logo of his company's legal department. I was at the hospital when he texted me a picture of it sitting on the kitchen counter. "They're asking for documentation about the transfer." He wrote, "HR and compliance." I didn't respond immediately. When I got home that evening, he was already there. The letter opened. Pages spread across the island like evidence in a crime show. "They're reviewing whether I violated internal disclosure policies," he said before I even set my bag down, "because the receiving account was co-owned by someone outside the company. Samantha Lee," I said calmly. He didn't deny it. "They're saying there may be a conflict of interest issue," he continued, "especially since she reports indirectly to my division." Indirectly. The word felt flimsy. "You opened a joint account with a subordinate while still legally married," I said, "and tried to move marital funds into it. It wasn't structured that way," he snapped. "It was personal. Personal didn't cancel professional consequences." He paced the length of the kitchen. "If this escalates, I could lose my equity grants," he muttered. Equity. The same equity he claimed was entirely his. I leaned against the counter and watched him unravel by degrees. 2 months ago, he had spoken about Vancouver like it was a fresh start. A clean break. A new skyline. Now he was calculating damage. "Did they contact her?" I asked. He hesitated. Yes, of course they had. The next morning, I received a subpoena request through Laura's office for additional financial records. Brandon's attorney was now arguing that my workers' compensation settlement had become commingled beyond separation and therefore subject to division. He was pivoting. Laura called me mid-shift. "They're attempting to dilute the origin of your settlement funds," she said. "But we have documentation showing the deposit and source. It strengthens your position, if anything." "So they're scrambling," I said. "They're adjusting strategy," she corrected. That evening, I checked social media for the first time since this began. Samantha Lee's profile had been scrubbed clean. Photos removed. Relationship status hidden. No more posts about new beginnings or global opportunities. A few mutual tech industry acquaintances had posted vague comments about internal reviews and policy clarifications. The ripples were spreading. Brandon came home later than usual, looking drained. "They've suspended her," he said flatly. "For what?" "Policy violations. Undisclosed personal financial entanglement. Conflict of interest." Entanglement. The word carried more weight than affair. He sat down heavily at the table. "This wasn't supposed to turn into this," he muttered. I folded my arms. "What was it supposed to turn into?" "A clean exit," he said. "We divide assets quietly. I relocate. No drama." "No drama." The irony almost made me smile. "You tried to transfer nearly $1 million out of a joint account without disclosure," I said. "That's not clean. That's concealment." He didn't argue this time. Instead, he stared at the letter from his company. "They're requesting tax documentation," he said. "If compliance flags this as an attempted improper transfer, it could trigger external reporting." External reporting. The phrase lingered between us. "You're worried about regulators now?" I asked. "I'm worried about reputational risk," he said. Reputation. For years. He had built his identity around being the composed, strategic engineer, the reliable executive, the man who understood systems. Now the system was looking back at him. The following week, we attended mediation to attempt temporary living expense agreements while the case proceeded. Brandon's attorney argued that the frozen accounts were restricting his ability to manage professional obligations. Laura countered with transaction logs and the pending Canadian account documentation. "He had sufficient liquidity prior to the freeze," she said evenly. "Any financial strain now is a consequence of his own actions." The mediator recommended partial unfreezing of funds strictly for mortgage payments and standard bills. Monitored through court-approved channels. Controlled access. Brandon looked like a man who had just been handed an allowance. Outside the mediation office, he turned to me. "You could stop this," he said quietly. "You could sign off on the transfer and let me leave." There it was. The plea disguised as logic. "And give up half of what's legally mine." I asked. "It's not about money," he insisted. "It's entirely about money," I replied. He looked at me as if I had transformed into someone unrecognizable. Maybe I had. Later that night, I logged into the brokerage account again. The balance remained intact, frozen but present. I clicked into the history and reviewed the line where my settlement funds had been deposited 2 years earlier. I remembered the night I left the hospital after that assault. My shoulder bruised, my hands shaking. Brandon had driven me home and promised we would build security from the payout. Security. Now I understood what that word really required. It required participation. The next morning, Laura forwarded me an update. His company has formally requested confirmation that no marital funds were misrepresented as personal compensation in the attempted transfer. She wrote, "This increases pressure." Pressure. That was what Brandon had always applied to me, subtle. Persistent, shaping my decisions. Now it was shaping him. That evening, he didn't argue. He sat at the far end of the couch, staring at his phone, reading emails in silence. "I didn't think you'd fight," he said finally. "I didn't think I'd have to," I replied. He nodded slowly, almost to himself. For the first time since this began, I sensed it fully. He hadn't just underestimated my knowledge. He had underestimated my threshold. And now the cost of that miscalculation was multiplying, in court, at his company, and in every plan he thought was already settled. The audit notice arrived on a Monday morning. It wasn't addressed to me, but to Brandon, stamped with the seal of the Internal Revenue Service, and marked as an inquiry regarding potential discrepancies in reported capital gains and foreign asset disclosure. He was at the kitchen table when I walked in from my shift. The letter unfolded in front of him, his coffee untouched. "They're reviewing the liquidation timeline," he said without looking up. "They want documentation of stock sales and intended use of proceeds. Because of the wire? I asked. Because of the wire during a pending divorce, he corrected, his voice tight. The brokerage's compliance review had apparently triggered a reporting protocol. Large cross-border transfers involving joint accounts and incomplete marital disclosure were not the kind of things that stayed invisible. They're asking whether I intended to classify the transfer under foreign income reinvestment, he said, and whether proper tax estimates were calculated. I set my bag down slowly. Were they? I asked. He didn't answer immediately. I had projections, he muttered. Projections. Not filings. Not confirmations. Laura called me later that afternoon. We anticipated something like this, she said. When large investment positions are liquidated rapidly, it creates reporting flags, especially if the proceeds are moved offshore. Is this criminal? I asked. Not necessarily, but it increases leverage in settlement negotiations. Leverage. The balance of power was shifting in ways Brandon had not modeled. 2 days later, we attended a preliminary evidentiary hearing to address expanded discovery. Brandon's attorney now looked less assured. Laura presented the timeline. Stock liquidation over 6 weeks. Failure to disclose pending transfer. Joint Canadian account with a third party. Attempted relocation. And my workers' compensation funds embedded within the transfer. The judge requested full financial transparency from both parties, including tax filings for the previous 3 years and detailed breakdowns of equity grants. Mr. Hayes, the judge said evenly. This court expects candor. Candor. It wasn't an accusation. It was a warning. Outside the courtroom, Brandon's phone buzzed repeatedly. He stepped aside to take the call. I caught fragments of his side of the conversation. Yes. I understand the risk exposure. No. It wasn't structured that way. I'll provide documentation. When he returned, his expression was sharper, more strained. They're reconsidering my upcoming equity vesting schedule, he said quietly. Pending resolution. Equity vesting. The cornerstone of his wealth projections. You said this wasn't about money, I reminded him. He didn't respond. That evening, I received a notice from the brokerage firm confirming that the attempted international transfer had been officially canceled due to court order and compliance review. Canceled. Not delayed. Not suspended. Canceled. The funds remained in the joint account, but the act itself was now recorded in permanent internal documentation. Brandon read the email over my shoulder. They're treating this like fraud, he said. They're treating it like a risk, I replied. He paced the length of the living room. If the IRS expands this into a full audit, it'll be months, he said. They'll review deductions, reporting, compensation structures, everything. Then everything should be clean, I said calmly. His eyes snapped to mine. You think I committed a crime? I think you tried to move marital assets without transparency. That's not a felony. I didn't say it was. The silence that followed wasn't explosive. It was heavy. Later that week, Samantha Lee's suspension became public within his company. An internal memo circulated citing violations of professional conduct standards and undisclosed financial entanglement with a married executive. Entanglement. The word seemed to follow them everywhere. Brandon received another call from corporate counsel. They're asking if any company-issued shares were used in a way that violates internal policy, he said afterward. If this becomes reputational damage, they could terminate. Terminate? The word echoed louder than any accusation. That night, he didn't argue. He didn't accuse me of dragging things out. Instead, he sat at the dining table with a calculator and spreadsheets open, recalculating potential tax exposure. You're still going to push for half, he asked quietly. Of what's legally ours, I replied. Yes. What if there's less than you think after penalties? I'll still push for half. He stared at me, as if recalibrating again. The following morning, Laura informed me that his attorney had requested a private settlement discussion. They're feeling pressure, she said. This is when people become more reasonable. Reasonable. a word that had once meant compromise to me. Now it meant preparedness. At the settlement conference, Brandon's attorney proposed a division that would allow him to retain a larger share of the brokerage in exchange for accelerated equity release to me through other assets. Laura leaned over and whispered, "They're trying to protect what they believe is most vulnerable to regulatory scrutiny." I studied Brandon across the table. For months, maybe longer. He had believed he controlled the variables. Now, external forces were entering the equation: compliance departments, tax reviewers, judges. "You don't have to destroy everything," he said softly during a break. When we stood alone in the hallway, "I'm not destroying anything," I said. "I'm preserving what's mine." He rubbed his temples. "This wasn't supposed to spiral." "You designed it to be invisible," I replied. It became visible. When we returned to the conference room, Laura countered with a revised proposal, emphasizing equal division of the brokerage and preservation of my settlement funds as traceable separate property. The negotiation lasted 4 hours. No agreement was reached. But something had changed. For the first time, Brandon was negotiating from defense, not dominance. That evening, as I logged into the brokerage account once more, I noticed the compliance notes attached to the canceled transfer. Documentation complete. Court order upheld. Monitoring ongoing. He had wanted to disappear quietly across a border. Instead, every move he made was now being observed. And the system he once trusted to amplify his success was now demanding explanations. For the first time since I read that wire confirmation email, I realized something undeniable. He wasn't trying to leave anymore. He was trying to contain damage. And I was no longer the variable he could ignore. The mediation room felt colder than the courtroom. Brandon sat across from me, shoulders slightly hunched. A man who had once projected certainty, now surrounded by folders labeled disclosure, compliance review, and supplemental tax inquiry. The mediator adjusted her glasses and looked between us. "We're here to determine whether this matter can resolve without extended litigation," she said calmly. "Extended litigation? Translation: months of subpoenas, depositions, and deeper scrutiny." Laura began with a concise summary. Equal division of the brokerage account. Full recognition of my workers' compensation settlement as traceable separate property. Sale of the marital home with proceeds split according to statute. Retirement accounts divided proportionally. Brandon's attorney countered with a revised proposal. "My client is willing to concede a larger percentage of liquid assets in exchange for expedited closure and confidentiality language," he said. Confidentiality. That word had not appeared in earlier negotiations. "What specifically requires confidentiality?" Laura asked evenly. Brandon shifted in his chair. "Internal corporate matters," his attorney replied. "Reputational considerations." Reputational considerations. The audit had expanded. 2 days earlier, Brandon had received formal notice that the IRS inquiry was no longer preliminary. They were requesting 3 years of detailed reporting, including stock vesting schedules, foreign asset disclosure forms, and any communication related to the attempted Canadian transfer. I had seen the envelope on the kitchen counter again. Thicker this time. At mediation, the mediator leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Hayes, are you concerned that prolonged litigation could intersect with your professional obligations?" He exhaled slowly. "Yes." It was the first time he had answered directly. Laura remained composed. "My client is not seeking to damage Mr. Hayes's career," she said. "She is seeking equitable distribution and protection of funds he attempted to transfer without disclosure." Attempted. The word hung between us like a quiet accusation. We took a break after 2 hours. I stepped into the hallway, phone in hand, staring at nothing in particular. Brandon followed. "They're asking about foreign reporting forms," he said in a low voice. If the Canadian account had finalized before the freeze, I would have had to file additional disclosures. "But it didn't finalize," I said. "Because you stopped it." I exercised my rights. He ran a hand through his hair, something he had been doing more often lately. They're reviewing my compensation structure now, he continued. If they believe I tried to obscure asset movement, it could jeopardize my vesting schedule. There it was again. Equity. Vesting. Everything reduced to projections. You said this wasn't about money, I reminded him. It's not just about money, he snapped. It's about stability. Stability. I thought about the night of my assault at the hospital. About the weeks of physical therapy. About depositing my settlement check into that joint brokerage account because he said it would create long-term stability. I built stability too, I said quietly. He didn't answer. When we returned to the mediation room, Brandon's attorney adjusted their offer again. My client proposes retaining primary control of the brokerage portfolio in exchange for a structured payout to Mrs. Hayes over 18 months. Structured payout. Laura leaned toward me and whispered, that benefits him if regulatory penalties reduce overall value later. He was still thinking ahead, still calculating risk. I want immediate division, I said clearly. Equal transfer into separate accounts. The mediator nodded slowly. That is consistent with equitable distribution guidelines, she said. Brandon's jaw tightened. You're going to force liquidation, he said. You forced liquidation, I replied. Silence filled the room. The mediator finally spoke again. Given the external reviews currently in motion, delay appears more detrimental to Mr. Hayes than to Mrs. Hayes. It wasn't said unkindly. It was simply fact. After 5 hours, we left without full agreement, but with something else, a narrowing of options. That night, Brandon didn't argue. He sat at the dining table surrounded by printed tax forms. They want documentation about estimated capital gains on the attempted transfer, he said without looking at me. Then provide it, I replied. He looked up. You don't understand how this works. I understand disclosure, I said. And I understand ownership. His phone buzzed again. He read the screen, then let out a sharp breath. What? I asked. Corporate is postponing my leadership review, he said. Pending resolution. Postponing. Not canceling. Not terminating. But delaying. The slow erosion of certainty. Over the next week, I watched the shift continue. He no longer spoke about Vancouver. He no longer mentioned new beginnings. Instead, he talked about documentation deadlines, about projected penalties, about potential settlement structures. The dream skyline had been replaced by spreadsheets. One evening, as I reviewed Laura's updated proposal, I noticed something subtle. Brandon's attorney had removed language requesting confidentiality. They were no longer trying to silence the process. They were trying to survive it. I logged into the brokerage account again. The balance was unchanged. Frozen. But intact. The Canadian account, according to documentation obtained through discovery, had been flagged for inactivity. No additional deposits. No further attempts. The relocation plan was officially dead. Not because he changed his mind. Because he lost control of the narrative. Late that night, he stood in the doorway of the guest bedroom, where he had started sleeping since mediation began. This is costing me more than I expected, he said quietly. It's costing both of us, I replied. He looked at me for a long moment. You could have just let me go, he said. I met his eyes. You could have just been honest. He didn't argue. For the first time since this started, I didn't see arrogance in him. I saw calculation replaced by consequence. And as I closed my laptop and turned off the light, I understood something clearly. He had tried to leave the country with assets he believed I wouldn't defend. Now he wasn't planning an exit. He was negotiating an escape from the fallout. And this time, he wasn't the only one holding leverage. The call from Laura came just before sunrise. They've proposed full equal division of the brokerage, she said without preamble. Immediate transfer into separate accounts. No structured delay. I sat up in bed, the early light barely filtering through the blinds. And the house? I asked. Sale proceeds split according to statute. No contest. And my settlement? Recognized as traceable separate property. preserved in your portion? I let that settle. After months of resistance, recalculations, and strategic pivots, he was conceding. What changed? I asked quietly. The IRS expanded the scope of review, she replied, and corporate counsel requested documentation directly from him about foreign account intent. Intent. The word had followed us from court to compliance to corporate policy. They want this closed, Laura continued. Quickly. So did I. By mid-morning, I was sitting at the dining table with a draft of the proposed agreement spread in front of me. Brandon stood across from me, hands resting on the back of a chair. This ends the freeze, he said. We divide the portfolio. You get your share transferred out immediately, and you keep yours. I replied. Yes. No more creative structuring. No more deferred promises. Just separation. Are there any confidentiality clauses? I asked. He hesitated. No. I read every page slowly. Every allocation line. Every reference to asset division. Every clause regarding tax liability for prior liquidations. Laura had inserted language specifying that any penalties or audit findings tied to the attempted international transfer would be Brandon's responsibility. He had signed off on that provision. I looked up at him. You're accepting liability for any consequences tied to the wire, I said. I don't have a choice. He replied. That was the truth. The following week, the brokerage firm executed the division. Half of the account balance, after preserving my documented settlement amount, was transferred into a newly opened investment account solely in my name. Primary owner, Samantha Hayes. No co-owner field beneath it. I stared at the confirmation email for a long moment. 8 years earlier, I had signed the original account paperwork, trusting that shared ownership meant shared protection. Now I understood that shared ownership also meant shared vulnerability. Brandon watched from across the kitchen as I reviewed the transfer confirmation. You got what you wanted, he said. I got what was mine, I corrected. The house went under contract 2 days later. The realtor returned with updated documents. And this time, I read every disclosure line myself. Mortgage payoff, closing costs, net proceeds calculation. Nothing slipped past me. At closing, we sat side by side but did not speak. The notary directed each signature carefully. When it was done, the funds were wired, half to my account, half to his. No detours through foreign banks. No pending status. Final. Later that afternoon, I drove to the bank and opened a separate high-yield savings account for a portion of the proceeds. I met with a financial advisor recommended by Laura and scheduled a portfolio review. For the first time, the conversation was mine alone. No one translating. No one summarizing. Just direct questions and direct answers. Meanwhile, Brandon's situation continued to shift. His company formally reduced his upcoming equity grant pending completion of the IRS review. Samantha Lee's suspension became termination. Her LinkedIn profile disappeared entirely. He no longer mentioned her name. One evening, as we finalized remaining personal property divisions, he stood in the doorway of what used to be our bedroom. I didn't think it would go this far, he said. You opened a joint account in another country and tried to move our assets into it. I replied. How far did you expect it to go? He didn't answer. Instead, he looked around the nearly empty room. I thought you'd take the settlement and move on quietly. He admitted. Why? Because you never questioned the finances before. He wasn't wrong. I hadn't. I had trusted. I question them now, I said. A week later, we attended the final court session to formalize the agreement. The judge reviewed the settlement terms, confirmed equitable distribution, and entered the divorce decree into the record. Both parties have acknowledged understanding of the financial provisions, she asked. Yes, Your Honor, I said. Yes, Brandon echoed. It was strangely anticlimactic. No dramatic confrontation. No raised voices. Just documentation processed and stamped. Outside the courthouse. Brandon paused. So that's it, he said. That's it. He looked at me, searching for something I couldn't identify. You didn't destroy me, he said quietly. I didn't try to, I replied. I tried to protect myself. He nodded once. As I walked to my car, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. Not relief exactly, but clarity. The Canadian plan had collapsed under scrutiny. The wire transfer had been cancelled. The joint account had been divided. The house had been sold. There was no dramatic victory speech, no cinematic justice, just balance restored through process. That evening, I sat in my new apartment, smaller but entirely mine, and logged into my investment account. The numbers on the screen represented more than capital. They represented awareness, participation, ownership. Brandon had once believed I wouldn't notice a nearly $1 million transfer. Now every line item was something I understood. He had planned to leave the country with his future neatly arranged. Instead, he remained in Charlotte, navigating audits and corporate reviews, while I sat in a space built from informed decisions. Not revenge, not destruction, just boundaries enforced. And for the first time in years, the word security meant something that didn't depend on anyone else's strategy. The first night in my new apartment was quieter than I expected. No suitcase wheels dragging across hardwood floors. No late-night conference calls taken in hushed voices behind a closed office door. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic drifting up from the street below. I sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by unopened boxes. My laptop balanced on my knees. My new brokerage account glowed on the screen. Primary owner, Samantha Hayes. The simplicity of it felt radical. For years, I had told myself I wasn't a numbers person. That finance was Brandon's domain the way medicine was mine. But as I scrolled through my portfolio allocations, index funds, bonds, remaining tech holdings, I realized something uncomfortable. I had never been incapable. I had just been uninvolved. The next morning, I met with Daniel, the financial advisor Laura had recommended. He was in his early 50s, calm, methodical, the opposite of Brandon's fast-talking confidence. Before we discuss strategy, he said, folding his hands on the table, I want to understand your goals. Goals. No one had asked me that in years. I want stability, I said. And control. He nodded. Stability doesn't require complexity, he replied. It requires clarity. We reviewed my assets in detail. He explained projected tax liabilities tied to the prior liquidation events. We adjusted allocations to reduce exposure while preserving growth potential. I asked questions. All of them. What happens if markets shift? How are dividends taxed? What are the long-term implications of this fund versus that one? I left the meeting with a binder of documents and something far more valuable. Confidence. Later that week, I received a call from the hospital administration office. My application for the nurse practitioner program had been accepted. I stood in the hallway outside the trauma unit, rereading the email 3 times. Congratulations. The word felt earned. That night, as I filled out enrollment paperwork, I caught myself smiling at the fine print instead of skipping it. Meanwhile, updates about Brandon filtered through mutual acquaintances and quiet legal updates. The IRS review remained active. His company had reduced his leadership responsibilities. Not a termination, but a lateral reassignment. A soft demotion. One evening, he called. I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. They finalized the audit scope, he said without greeting. It'll be months. Then you'll handle it, I replied. I am. Silence lingered. I didn't think you'd rebuild this fast, he said. I didn't think I'd have to rebuild at all, I answered. He exhaled slowly. Samantha's gone, he added. I know. She moved back to her home state. There was no triumph in hearing that. Just closure. After we hung up, I stepped onto the small balcony outside my apartment. The city lights stretched out below me, steady and indifferent. He had once believed his exit plan was flawless. But flawless plans rarely account for overlooked variables. I had been his overlooked variable. A week later, I attended an orientation session for the nurse practitioner program. I sat in a lecture hall surrounded by professionals from different backgrounds, nurses, paramedics, physician assistants, all seeking advancement. During introductions, I described myself simply. I'm Samantha, emergency department nurse, interested in advanced practice. No mention of divorce. No mention of frozen accounts or wire transfers. Just forward motion. Back at work, something subtle shifted. A younger nurse named Alicia approached me during a break. I heard you went through a complicated divorce, she said hesitantly. Can I ask you something? Sure. How do you know if you're too financially dependent? The question caught me off guard. I considered my answer carefully. If you don't know where the money is, I said, that's a start. She nodded slowly. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my apartment for 2 close friends from the hospital. We sat at my small dining table, laughing about shift chaos and residency horror stories. At one point, one of them raised a glass. To new beginnings, she said. I smiled. Not new beginnings. Informed ones. Later that night, alone again, I logged into my investment account one more time. The numbers fluctuated slightly with market movement, but they were stable, accessible, transparent. I remembered the night I had first seen that international wire confirmation, the cold shock, the stillness. Back then, I thought the most painful part was betrayal. Now I understood something else. The most dangerous part had been ignorance. Brandon had assumed I would accept whatever settlement he offered. He had assumed I wouldn't read the transaction logs. He had assumed I wouldn't understand joint ownership. He had assumed wrong. As I closed my laptop and turned off the lights, I felt no need for revenge fantasies or dramatic justice. The account was divided. The house was sold. The decree was finalized. The rest, audits, career consequences, corporate politics, belonged to him. What belonged to me was simpler. A clear ledger. A new career path. A space that echoed with possibility instead of tension. He had tried to leave the country with nearly $1 million and a rewritten narrative. Instead, he stayed, and I moved forward. Not because he fell, but because I learned how to stand. The first tuition payment felt heavier than the brokerage transfer ever had. I sat at my small kitchen table, laptop open, staring at the enrollment portal for the nurse practitioner program. The number on the screen represented a significant portion of the house proceeds I had set aside. 2 months earlier, that money had been part of a joint investment strategy I barely understood. Now it was a decision I was making alone. I clicked Submit Payment. A confirmation page appeared instantly. Transaction complete. I exhaled slowly. That night, I rearranged my living room to accommodate a study desk. It wasn't large, just enough space for textbooks, a laptop, and a desk lamp, but it felt intentional. My life was no longer reactive. It was structured. The next few weeks settled into a rhythm. Clinical shifts, evening classes, reading case studies until midnight, reviewing pharmacology notes while sipping reheated coffee. It was exhausting, but it was my exhaustion. Meanwhile, Brandon's situation continued to unfold in ways that no longer directly involved me, yet still echoed in the background. The IRS audit officially expanded into a comprehensive review of capital gains reporting tied to the stock liquidations. His company issued a formal letter placing him under a compliance probationary status pending resolution. He called once, late on a Thursday evening. They're reviewing my previous equity disclosures, he said. If they determine I mischaracterized the intended use of proceeds, they could claw back part of my vesting. Claw back. I closed my textbook slowly. I'm sorry you're dealing with that, I said, and meant it in the most neutral way possible. You're not angry anymore, he said. I'm not invested anymore, I replied. There was a difference. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't think the audit would go this deep, he admitted. I didn't think you'd move nearly $1 million without telling me, I said. Silence again. We had reached a place beyond argument. Consequences were now administrative, not emotional. A week later, I received the first quarterly statement for my individual investment account. I reviewed it carefully, line by line. Projected growth, dividend reinvestments, tax withholdings. I understood each category now. Not because I had become a financial expert overnight, but because I had stopped outsourcing awareness. At the hospital, my supervisors began assigning me more complex cases as part of my advanced training track. "You're stepping up," one attending physician said after a particularly intense shift. "There's a steadiness about you." I almost laughed. If only he knew. Steadiness had been forged in courtrooms and compliance emails as much as in trauma bays. One evening after class, I ran into Alicia again in the parking lot. "I checked my joint account," she said quietly. "You were right. I didn't even know half of what was there." "What did you do?" I asked. I asked questions. I smiled. That was enough. Meanwhile, Brandon's corporate probation became official. His leadership review was postponed indefinitely. Samantha Lee remained terminated, her name gradually fading from industry circles. He no longer mentioned her in our brief logistical communications about final property transfers. The Canadian account was officially closed. No relocation. No skyline. Just paperwork. One afternoon, Laura forwarded me a final update regarding the audit inquiry. "Preliminary findings suggest underestimation of projected capital gains exposure," she wrote. "Liability remains his responsibility per settlement terms." I stared at the sentence for a long time. Liability remains his responsibility. A clean boundary. That night, sitting at my study desk, I opened an old folder from the early years of my marriage. Inside were scanned copies of documents I had once signed without reading. Joint account agreements, beneficiary designations, investment authorizations. I read them now with a different lens. Every signature represented authority. Every line of fine print represented potential leverage. I closed the folder gently. The divorce had been finalized months ago, but this felt like the real closure. Not because he suffered consequences, but because I understood the mechanics that had once intimidated me. Brandon called one last time near the end of the semester. "They've finalized the audit," he said. "And," I asked, "penalties? Not criminal, but substantial." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'll manage," he added. "I know you will," I said. He hesitated. "I underestimated you," he said quietly. "Yes," I replied. There was no bitterness in my voice. Just fact. After we hung up, I stepped onto the balcony again. The air was cooler now, fall creeping in. The city lights flickered steadily below. I thought about the night of the wire transfer, the glow of the iPad, the word permanent. He had planned to leave the country with his future secured. Instead, he stayed and recalculated. I stayed too, but I recalculated something different. My worth, my knowledge, my participation. The nearly $1 million he tried to move had once symbolized escape. Now it symbolized education, security, choice. I returned inside and opened my pharmacology textbook. There were still exams ahead. Clinical rotations, long nights. But none of it felt imposed. It felt chosen. And that made all the difference. The house closed on a Tuesday afternoon. I stood in the empty living room one last time before handing over the keys. The echo of my footsteps bouncing off walls that had once held framed photos and carefully staged furniture. It didn't feel tragic. It felt finished. The buyer's agent waited in the driveway while I walked through each room slowly. The kitchen where I had read that international wire confirmation email. The dining table where Brandon had explained capital gains as if I wouldn't understand. The hallway where we once planned renovations that would never happen. I ran my hand along the kitchen counter and then stepped back. Memories didn't have to mean ownership. At closing, the funds were distributed exactly as the settlement required. Half wired to my account, half to his. No detours. No international routing numbers. I drove directly from the title office to the bank. The teller greeted me politely as I requested a portion of the proceeds be applied toward my remaining student loan balance. Full payoff, she asked. Yes, I said. The number on the screen dropped to 0. I felt something loosen inside me that had been tight for years. Debt cleared. One less invisible tether. That evening, I logged into my investment account again and rebalanced my portfolio according to the strategy Daniel and I had discussed. Conservative growth. Diversified exposure. Emergency reserve intact. It wasn't flashy. It was stable. Brandon texted me later that night. The house money came through, he wrote. I know, I replied. They're restructuring my role at work, he added. It's not a demotion. More like a lateral adjustment. Lateral adjustment. A gentler phrase for recalibration. I hope it works out, I said. And I meant it. Because by then, his outcome no longer dictated my direction. A few days later, I signed the final enrollment documents for the advanced clinical rotation in my nurse practitioner program. The coursework was heavier now. Diagnostic simulations. Prescriptive authority case studies. Independent assessment drills. I stayed up late most nights reviewing material, but it wasn't anxiety keeping me awake. It was ambition. One afternoon, after finishing a particularly demanding shift, I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and opened my email. A message from the program director. You've been selected for a competitive clinical placement next semester. I closed my eyes and let the words settle. Selected. Chosen. Not tolerated. Not settled for. That weekend, I met Daniel again to review my updated financial position after the house sale and loan payoff. You're in a strong place, he said, sliding a printed summary across the desk. No consumer debt. Investment growth stable. Cash reserves healthy. For the first time in my adult life, my financial picture was uncomplicated. No joint logins. No second names. Just transparency. Meanwhile, the IRS finalized its findings regarding Brandon's liquidation reporting. He owed penalties and adjusted capital gains taxes, substantial, but manageable. His company retained him under probationary compliance terms. He called once to inform me. It's resolved, he said. Expensive lesson. I imagine, I replied. He paused. You really changed, he said quietly. No, I answered. I started paying attention. There was a difference. Later that week, I hosted a small study group in my apartment for classmates. Textbooks spread across my dining table. Highlighters scattered between coffee mugs. At one point, someone joked about signing a lease without reading the fine print. I smiled. Read everything, I said lightly. Even the boring parts. They laughed. But I wasn't joking. After everyone left, I stepped onto my balcony and looked out at the city again. It struck me how much had shifted in a single year. 12 months ago, I had been standing in a kitchen lit by the glow of an iPad, reading a wire transfer confirmation that threatened to erase my financial stability. Now I stood in an apartment fully funded by informed decisions. Brandon had once believed I didn't understand finance, that I wouldn't question liquidation schedules or joint account authorizations. He believed my world was confined to hospital corridors and patient charts. He forgot that competence transfers. If I could stabilize a crashing patient under fluorescent lights and alarmed monitors, I could stabilize my own life under quieter pressures. I went back inside and opened my laptop. My investment dashboard loaded instantly. Primary owner. Samantha Hayes. Projected long-term growth? Steady. I clicked through each allocation carefully, reviewing percentages and future contributions I planned to automate. Automation. Not abdication. There was a difference. Before going to bed, I deleted Brandon's contact from my favorites list. Not out of anger. Out of closure. He was no longer central to my notifications. No longer the person managing the complicated parts. The complicated parts were no longer complicated. They were understood. As I turned off the lights and slid under the covers, one thought surfaced clearly. He once assumed I wouldn't notice a nearly $1 million transfer. Now I noticed everything, and that awareness was worth more than any settlement figure. The life I was building didn't require revenge. It required vigilance. And for the first time in years, I trusted myself to provide it. 1 year after the night I saw that international wire confirmation. I walked into the hospital wearing a different badge. Nurse practitioner, clinical track. The letters were small, but they felt enormous. I paused for a moment near the entrance, watching the automatic doors slide open and closed as patients and staff moved in steady rhythm. This building had witnessed my worst exhaustion, my quiet resilience, and the day I realized my marriage had been quietly dismantled behind my back. Now it witnessed something else. Momentum. The IRS review had officially concluded 2 months earlier. Brandon paid the assessed penalties and adjusted capital gains liabilities. No criminal charges. No headlines. Just paperwork, recalculated projections, and a diminished equity schedule. His relocation plan to Canada had dissolved into a line item in an audit report. The Canadian joint account was closed permanently. There was no dramatic collapse. Just consequence. He sent one final email after the audit resolution. "I've learned a lot this year," he wrote, "about risk." I stared at the sentence for a long moment before replying, "So have I." That was enough. Closure doesn't require forgiveness. It requires finality. That afternoon, during a clinical rotation, I independently assessed a patient with complex symptoms that would have intimidated me a year earlier. I moved through the diagnostic steps calmly, explaining each possibility with clarity. Afterward, the supervising physician nodded. "You trust your judgment now," he said. Yes, I did. Later that evening, I returned to my apartment and opened my laptop out of habit. My investment dashboard loaded immediately. Primary owner, Samantha Hayes. I reviewed my automated contributions, my diversified allocations, my long-term projections. I no longer checked the numbers out of fear. I checked them out of ownership. The nearly $1 million that once symbolized betrayal had transformed into something else entirely. Education. Independence. Awareness. Brandon once believed I didn't understand finance, that I wouldn't notice liquidation patterns or international transfers, that I would accept a fair settlement without reading the structure behind it. He miscalculated one variable. Me. He underestimated the woman who could read vital signs in seconds and make life or death decisions under pressure. He forgot that the same discipline applied outside the hospital walls. The difference was never intelligence. It was attention. I stepped onto the balcony as the sun dipped below the skyline, the city glowing in warm light. A year ago, I stood in a kitchen lit by an iPad screen, reading the word permanent next to a relocation plan that excluded me. Today, I stood in a space funded by informed choices, enrolled in a program that advanced my career, holding an investment account that answered to no one else. Revenge was never about ruining him. It was about refusing to be erased. Justice didn't arrive in a dramatic courtroom speech or a public downfall. It arrived in small confirmations. Transfer complete. Loan paid off. Enrollment accepted. Primary owner. He tried to leave the country with my future in his pocket. What brought him back wasn't love. It wasn't regret. It was the one signature he assumed I didn't understand. And if there's one thing this year taught me, it's this: never sign anything you haven't read. Never surrender control of what you don't fully understand. And never assume you're not good with money just because someone else speaks louder about it. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever trusted someone with your financial security without fully knowing the details, share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one. If you believe women deserve clarity, protection, and power over their own assets, stay with this channel. Subscribe for more stories about hidden power, quiet accountability, and the moments that change everything. Because sometimes justice doesn't come from shouting. Sometimes it comes from one carefully placed signature. And sometimes, that's more than enough. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.